You're listening to Seeker of the Word, where we explore the truth of Scripture together. I'm grateful you're here, and if you're seeking deeper understanding, you're not alone. Welcome back to Seeker of the Word. I'm Mike, and today we're diving into something deeply human. Something that touches all of us, yet often leaves us confused or even ashamed. Guilt. It's heavy, it lingers, it whispers in our minds, tugs at our thoughts, and sometimes even haunts our dreams. But here's the real question. Why? Why does this feeling live inside us, even when no one's looking? If we were just products of evolution, if our brains are built just to survive, then why does guilt stick around, even when it serves no obvious purpose? What if guilt isn't just a glitch in our programming? What if it's pointing to something deeper? Let's explore that together. Let's begin with what science tells us. Psychologists and neuroscientists agree guilt is not just a mood. It's not just something we feel. It is physical. It is neurological. When researchers use fMRI scans, those brain scans that track activity, they found that guilt lights up very specific parts of the brain. In one study published in Nature Neuroscience, researchers Zan and colleagues found that guilt activates the anterior temporal lobe, the subgenual cingulate cortex, and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. These are big names, but what matters is this. These are the regions that help us process social emotions. Things like empathy, memory, and moral reasoning. Some neuroscientists even call them the conscience committee. In other words, guilt is wired into how we see others, how we reflect on ourselves, and how we make moral decisions. Another study, this one by Freud and team in Frontiers in Human Neuroscience, showed that guilt strongly activates a part of the brain called the anterior cingulate cortex. That part is known for picking up on errors and internal conflict. So what does this all mean? It means guilt might function like a moral feedback system. It tells us when something inside us is not aligned with who we think we should be. But here's where it gets interesting, because from an evolutionary point of view, guilt doesn't quite make sense. Sure, some scientists argue that guilt evolved to help groups survive. If I feel bad for hurting you, I am more likely to make peace, and that keeps the tribe together. But that only explains short-term behavior. What about guilt that sticks around for years? What about feeling guilty for things no one else even knows about? Freud thought that guilt came from our internalized social rules, our superego, punishing us from stepping out of line. But even Freud struggled to explain why guilt shows up when there is no punishment, no social pressure, and no one watching. Let's widen the lens even further. If guilt were just a Western or religious invention, we might expect it to vary wildly across cultures. But it does not. Across major worldviews, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, we find ideas that look and feel a lot like guilt. Let's take a quick tour. In Judaism, guilt is more than legal wrongdoing. It's personal, relational. The Hebrew concept of Hashem, the guilt offering, was a way to restore not just justice, but relationship with God. In Leviticus 5, you will see that guilt is something that requires confession, repentance, and restoration. In Islam, there's the concept of nafs al-lawamah, the self-reproaching soul. It's the part of you that knows when you've done wrong and calls you back to repentance. Forgiveness is always possible in Islam, but guilt is real, and it's meant to point you toward God's mercy. In Hinduism, guilt is often tied to the idea of karma, the moral consequences of our actions. When someone violates dharma, their moral duty, it creates a kind of inner impurity. The result might not be labeled guilt, but the experience is similar: unease, restlessness, and the need for purification through rituals, fasting, or penance. In Buddhism, guilt is usually discouraged, especially when it turns into shame or self-hatred. But there's a healthy counterpart: remorse, known as hiri and otapa, moral dread and fear of wrongdoing. These are not weaknesses. They're called the guardians of the world. It's to keep behavior in check, keeping us mindful of how our actions affect others. Even secular humanism, which does not appeal to a God or spiritual truth, still echoes the language of guilt. Words like integrity, accountability, and personal responsibility all show up in ethics without religion. And yet, the experience is the same: sleepless nights, regret, the desire to make things right. So where does this all leave us? If guilt is just cultural, why does it show up across all cultures? If it's just chemical, why does it feel so personal? Is it possible that guilt isn't a flaw in our design? What if it's a feature? Let's make this personal. Think back to a time you said something in anger, something you didn't mean. The moment passed, but the memory didn't. Did it? You replayed it over and over in your head. Maybe you tried to justify it. I was tired. They provoked me. But still, something didn't sit right. That's not just a habit. That's not just training. That's conscience. It's the inner voice that says, this wasn't who you were meant to be. Let me share a story. A friend of mine once told me about his grandmother. She ran a sari-sari store. One day, she accidentally underpaid a supplier, just a small amount. She did not realize it until weeks later. But when she did, she walked 2 barangays over, on foot, to pay it back. No one asked her to. No one would have noticed. But she said, I couldn't sleep until I made it right. That's not just culture. That's something deeper. Now think about how we, as a society, deal with guilt. We create entire rituals around it. In churches, there's confession. In tribal cultures, there are cleansing ceremonies. In modern life, we have apology videos, cancel culture, social shaming. We're not just looking for justice. We're looking for cleansing. We want the slate wiped clean. We want to be free again. Why? Because guilt doesn't feel like we've broken a rule. It feels like we've broken a relationship. So maybe the question isn't just, why do I feel guilty? Maybe the real question is, who am I guilty before? Could guilt be more than just emotional baggage? Could it be a built-in signal meant not to shame you, but to call you home, to healing, to restoration? In our next episode, we'll explore that question even deeper. What if guilt isn't just meant to be left, but to be answered? And if it can be answered, what would that answer look like? Thanks for joining me on Seeker of the Word. If today's episode gave you something to think about, I'd like to hear from you. Until next time, keep seeking, and may your search lead you closer to the truth. Thank you for joining Seeker of the Word. Keep seeking, keep growing. See you next time.